That Tuesday morning started like any other. Until Margaret Thornfield marched across my driveway with her clipboard in one hand and her phone camera pointed at my 1970s John Deere tractor like it was some kind of criminal evidence. She had no idea that the asphalt beneath her designer heels belonged to me, that every curve of Willowbrook Lane had been carved out by my own bulldozers 15 years ago. She definitely didn't know that her precious homeowners association was about to learn the most expensive lesson of their existence. As she slapped that bright orange towing notice on my tractor's hood, declaring it an eyesore that violated community standards, one thought crossed my mind. How do you explain to someone that they've been trespassing on your property for over a decade? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The whole mess started because I was being a good neighbor. My next-door neighbor, Frank Martinez, was 73 years old and stubborn as a mule. The previous week's storm had dumped a massive oak tree across his backyard, and the city cleanup crews were backed up for weeks. Frank had been out there every morning with a handsaw, trying to tackle branches thicker than his torso. I couldn't stand watching him struggle anymore. That's why my tractor was parked in my driveway instead of locked away in the garage, where the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association apparently thought all farm equipment should live. I'd spent the morning helping Frank drag storm debris to the curb, using the tractor's hydraulic lift to move logs that would have taken him months to clear by hand. The old machine might have looked rough around the edges with its faded green paint and a few rust spots, but it ran like a dream and could outwork any fancy riding mower in the neighborhood. I was in my workshop, cleaning hydraulic fluid off my hands, when I heard the sharp click of heels on concrete. Through the window, I watched Margaret Thornfield stride up my driveway like she owned the place. Margaret had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years ago, right after her divorce from some pharmaceutical executive. She'd immediately inserted herself into every committee and board she could find, eventually clawing her way to the HOA presidency on a platform of maintaining property values and preserving community standards. Margaret was the type of person who measured grass height with a ruler and kept a color chart to ensure everyone's house paint fell within approved shades. She wore her auburn hair in a perfect bob that never seemed to move, even on windy days, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of pressed blazers and pencil skirts that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Today she was wearing a navy blue ensemble that screamed authority, complete with a badge reading HOA President pinned to her lapel like she was running for office. She walked around my tractor slowly, taking photos from every angle with her phone. The way she examined it reminded me of a crime scene investigator documenting evidence. She even crouched down to photograph the license plate and serial numbers, her heels clicking against the concrete with each step. The whole performance was designed to intimidate, to make it clear that she was the one in charge here. I stepped out of the workshop, wiping my hands on an old rag. "Morning, Margaret. Something I can help you with?" She straightened up and fixed me with a look that could have frozen water in July. "Mr. Carter, I'm documenting this violation of community standards for our records." She held up her phone, snapping another photo of me standing next to the tractor. "This industrial equipment is in clear violation of Willowbrook Estates Covenant Section 4.7, which specifically prohibits the parking of farm equipment, commercial vehicles, or unsightly machinery in dashen, driveways, or other visible areas." "It's a tractor, Margaret, and it's on my property. It's an eyesore that's negatively impacting property values throughout our community." She pulled a bright orange notice from her clipboard and slapped it against the tractor's windshield. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze, its bold red letters declaring violation notice in threatening font. "You have 72 hours to remove this equipment to an enclosed garage or off-site storage facility. Failure to comply will result in towing at owner's expense." I looked at the notice, then back at Margaret. She was standing there with her arms crossed, waiting for me to either grovel or explode. Instead, I folded the rag and tucked it into my back pocket. "Margaret, would you mind taking a walk with me?" Her perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Excuse me?" "Just a short walk, right here in the neighborhood." I gestured toward the street. "I think there's something you should see." She glanced around suspiciously, probably wondering if this was some kind of trap. "I don't have time for games, Mr. Carter. The notice speaks for itself." "No games, just a quick walk down the road you drove in on." I started walking toward the street, not bothering to look back. "Trust me, it'll be worth your time." After a moment of hesitation, I heard her heels clicking behind me. We walked to the edge of my property, where my driveway met Willowbrook Lane. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of a lawnmower and the occasional bird call. Mature oak trees lined both sides of the road, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dappled patterns on the asphalt. "Nice road, isn't it?" I said, stopping at the curb. "Smooth asphalt, good drainage, properly banked curves, real quality construction." Margaret looked around impatiently. "Mr. Carter, I don't see what this has to do with your tractor violation." "Oh, it has everything to do with it." I knelt down and ran my hand over the asphalt surface. "See? This road was built back in 2008. When Willowbrook Estates was just an empty field and a developer's dream. The original builder, Morrison Development, hired my company, Carter Construction, to handle all the infrastructure. Roads, drainage, systems, utility access, the whole works." I could see Margaret's expression starting to shift from annoyance to uncertainty. She was smart enough to sense where this was heading, but not quite ready to believe it. "We worked on this project for 8 months, I continued, standing and brushing dust off my hands. "Me and my crew laid every foot of asphalt in this development. Willowbrook Lane, Maple Ridge Drive, Sunset Circle, all of it. Beautiful work, if I do say so myself. Still holding up perfectly after 15 years. "That's very interesting, Mr. Carter, but it doesn't change the fact that your equipment is in violation of our covenants." I smiled and pulled out my phone. "Here's the thing about those covenants, Margaret. They only apply to homeowners within the jurisdiction of the HOA, and, technically speaking, you're not standing on HOA property right now." "That's ridiculous. This is a private road within Willowbrook Estates." "You're absolutely right. It is a private road, but it's not owned by the HOA. I scrolled through my phone until I found what I was looking for. When Morrison Development went bankrupt in 2009, right after the housing market crashed, there were a lot of loose ends to tie up. Most of the assets got sold off to pay creditors, but there was one little detail that got overlooked. Margaret's face was starting to lose some of its color. "What detail?" "The road easements. See, when we built these roads, Morrison insisted on a specific clause in our contract. Instead of transferring full ownership to the HOA once construction was complete, they wanted to maintain control over the infrastructure for liability purposes. Smart move, actually, from a legal standpoint. The easement agreement stated that the roads would remain property of Morrison Development, with usage rights granted to homeowners." I could see her mind working, trying to find the flaw in my story. Even if that were true, Morrison Development is gone. The roads would have reverted to the HOA or the county. That's what you'd think, wouldn't you? But bankruptcy law is funny that way. When Morrison couldn't pay my company the final installment for our work, about $200,000, we had to file a mechanic's lien against the property. That lien included the road systems we built since they were part of the project. Margaret's phone slipped slightly in her hands. "You're making this up." "When the bankruptcy court liquidated Morrison's assets, my lien gave us first rights to claim the roads as compensation for unpaid work. I didn't think much of it at the time. Honestly, what was I going to do with a bunch of roads in the middle of a half-built development? But my lawyer advised me to follow through with the claim, just in case the property ever became valuable." End quote. I gestured toward the houses lighting the street, their manicured lawns and expensive landscaping clearly visible. "Turns out that was pretty good advice. You're telling me you own the roads? Every foot of asphalt, every storm drain, every utility access point?" I pulled up a document on my phone and showed it to her. It was a copy of the deed transfer from the bankruptcy court, clearly stating that the road infrastructure of Willowbrook Estates had been awarded to Carter Construction LLC in satisfaction of outstanding liens. then paying property taxes on them for the last 15 years. Margaret stared at the document, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and what might have been panic. This can't be legal. The HOA has been maintaining these roads for years. And I appreciate that, I really do. Saves me a lot of work. I put my phone away and looked around at the well-maintained street. You folks have done a great job keeping everything in good condition. Really adds to the property value. Property value? Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Are you suggesting we've been maintaining your property without compensation? Oh, I wouldn't say without compensation. You've all been getting the benefit of using the roads, after all. I've been happy to let that slide as an informal arrangement between neighbors. I paused, letting that sink in. Of course, if we want to make things official, we'd need to discuss proper usage fees. The color drained completely from Margaret's face. Usage fees? Standard rate for private road access in this area runs about $50 per month per household. With 47 homes in the development, that comes to about $28,200 annually. I did the math in my head, enjoying the way Margaret's eyes widened with each number. Retroactive to when the HOA was first established in 2010, that would be about $423,000 in unpaid usage fees. Margaret clutched her clipboard so tightly her knuckles went white. You can't be serious. I'm always serious about business, Margaret. But, like I said, we've had an informal arrangement up until now. I've been content to let things slide because everyone's been reasonable. I glanced pointedly at the orange notice still fluttering on my tractor. But if we're going to start getting formal about property rights and violations, well, I guess we'll need to formalize everything. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the road beneath her feet like she was seeing it for the first time. When she finally looked up, some of her composure had returned, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not admitting it is, you still can't park farm equipment in violation of community standards. Community standards? I laughed. Margaret, my tractor isn't violating any community standards. It's parked on my driveway, on my property, accessible via roads that I own. If anything, your little clipboard crusade is the violation here. N. How do you figure that? Trespassing, for starters. You walked onto my property without permission to document my personal belongings. Then there's harassment, attempting to intimidate a property owner in the lawful use of his land. I started counting on my fingers. Oh, and let's not forget the threat to have my property towed from my own driveway. I'm pretty sure that falls under attempted theft. Margaret's professional facade was starting to crack. The HOA has legitimate authority to enforce community standards. Within the HOA's jurisdiction, sure, but not on my driveway, and definitely not on roads that I own. I pulled the orange notice off my tractor and handed it back to her. I think you'll want to reconsider this violation notice. She didn't take the paper. This isn't over, Mr. Carter. No, I don't suppose it is. I watched her turn and storm back toward her car, her heels clicking rapidly against the asphalt. Margaret? I called after her. She stopped, but didn't turn around. Next HOA meeting is Thursday night, right? I think I'll attend. They're meaning to get more involved in community affairs. The sound of her car door slamming echoed through the neighborhood. That evening, I called my lawyer, Tom Brennan, who'd handled the original lien filing and road transfer. Tom was one of those attorneys who looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s movie, complete with suspenders and wire-rimmed glasses. He specialized in construction law and had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. Jesse, good to hear from you, Tom said when he picked up the phone. How's retirement treating you? Not quite retired yet, but getting there. Tom, I need you to pull out the Willowbrook Estates file. There was a pause, followed by the sound of filing cabinets opening. Willowbrook, here we go. Morrison Development bankruptcy case. What's going on? I explained the morning's encounter with Margaret and the HOA's threat to tow my tractor. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally making humming sounds that meant he was taking notes. So they've been maintaining the roads all this time without realizing you own them? Tom asked when I finished. Seems that way. I never thought much about it until today. Figured live and let live, you know? But if they want to play hardball with property rights, I'm happy to educate them. Oh, this is rich, Tom chuckled. Do you realize what kind of position this puts them in? They've been acting as your unpaid maintenance crew for over a decade, and now they're threatening to tow your equipment from your own property? That's about the size of it. What are my options? Well, you could start by sending them a cease and desist letter. Make it clear that any further harassment or trespassing will result in legal action. But Jesse, if you really want to make a point, we could formalize the road usage arrangement. You mean actually charge them for using the roads? It's your property. You have every right to control access and charge reasonable fees for usage. Given that they've been maintaining the roads, you could even argue for a retroactive billing arrangement. I thought about Margaret's face when I'd mentioned the usage fees. What kind of numbers are we talking about? For a private road system of this size and quality, $50 to $75 per month per household would be reasonable. Factor in the years of unpaid usage, and you're looking at a substantial sum. Tom's voice took on the tone he used when he smelled a particularly interesting legal challenge. Of course, there's also the matter of property improvements. All that maintenance and upkeep they've been doing without your consent technically constitutes improvements to your property. Meaning they might actually owe you for increasing your property value. It's called unjust enrichment. They've been benefiting from your property while simultaneously improving it without your permission. The more Tom talked, the more I realized how deep a hole the HOA had dug for themselves. What do you recommend? Let me draft a formal letter outlining your ownership of the roads and demanding they cease any harassment or trespassing. We'll give them 30 days to respond and acknowledge your property rights. If they want to continue using the roads, they can negotiate a formal easement agreement. And if they don't, then we explore other options, restricting access, charging fees, maybe even a lawsuit for trespassing and harassment. Tom paused. Jesse, how attached are you to keeping the peace with your neighbors? I've got nothing against most of them. It's just Margaret and her power trip that's the problem. Good, because this could get interesting very quickly. 2 days later, Tom's letter arrived via certified mail at the HOA's official address, which happened to be Margaret's home office. I knew because I was working in my garden when the postal truck pulled up to her house, and I heard her signature through the open window when she signed for the envelope. The letter was a masterpiece of legal precision. In 3 pages of carefully crafted language, Tom laid out the complete history of the road ownership, from the original construction contract through the bankruptcy proceedings to the current deed status. He included copies of all relevant documents, the construction contract, the mechanic's lien, the bankruptcy court order, and the current property tax records showing my ongoing ownership of the road infrastructure. But the real stroke of genius was Tom's calculation of what he called accumulated usage fees and property improvement costs. He'd researched comparable private road systems throughout the county and determined that $55 per month per household was the standard rate. Multiplied by 47 households over 15 years of HOA control, the total came to $463,500 in unpaid usage fees. Then there was the matter of unauthorized property improvements. Tom had obtained records of all the road maintenance and improvement work the HOA had performed over the years, from annual seal coating to pothole repairs to the decorative streetlight installation in 2018. The total value of these improvements was approximately $120,000, all of which had been performed on my property without my consent. Under the legal doctrine of unjust enrichment, Tom argued that the HOA had been wrongfully benefiting from my property, while simultaneously increasing its value without compensation to the rightful owner. The letter demanded immediate cessation of all harassment and trespassing, formal acknowledgement of my property rights, and good faith negotiations toward a retroactive usage agreement. The final paragraph was particularly satisfying. Please be advised that any further attempts to interfere with Mr. Carter's lawful use of his property, including but not limited to threats of towing legally parked vehicles, will be considered harassment and trespassing and will result in immediate legal action seeking damages and injunctive relief. Tom had given them 30 days to respond, but I didn't have to wait that long. Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Monday night. I'd never actually attended an HOA meeting before, despite living in the neighborhood for over 6 years. The meetings were usually held in Margaret's living room, which had been converted into a sort of command center with a large conference table, a whiteboard covered in charts and schedules, and filing cabinets along every wall. Tonight, however, they moved the meeting to the community clubhouse to accommodate what I suspected would be a larger-than-usual crowd. The clubhouse was a modest building at the center of the development, featuring a main meeting room, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. It had been built by the original developer as a selling point for potential buyers, though it rarely saw much use beyond the monthly HOA meetings and the occasional birthday party. Tonight, nearly every seat was filled. I arrived a few minutes before the 7 o'clock start time and took a seat near the back. The room buzzed with conversation as neighbors who rarely spoke to each other huddled in small groups, whispering and gesturing. I recognized most of the faces from years of casual waves and brief conversations over garden fences, but tonight everyone seemed to be looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Margaret sat at the head of the room, her usual commanding presence somewhat diminished by the stress lines around her eyes and the way she kept shuffling through a stack of papers. The other board members, Vice President Rick Coleman and Treasurer Sandra Liu, flanked her like uncomfortable bodyguards. Rick was a retired insurance adjuster who'd moved to the neighborhood about 5 years ago, while Sandra worked as an accountant downtown and had volunteered for the treasurer position mainly because nobody else wanted to deal with the finances. At exactly 7 o'clock, Margaret called the meeting to order. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's emergency session. As you may have heard, we've received some concerning correspondence that affects the entire community. A murmur ran through the room. I noticed several people glancing in my direction. Before we discuss the main issue, Margaret continued, I want to address some rumors that have been circulating. It's important that we all have accurate information before making any decisions. She held up Tom's letter, its legal letterhead clearly visible even from the back of the room. Earlier this week, the HOA received a letter from an attorney representing Jesse Carter. She gestured toward me, and now everyone was definitely staring. The letter makes certain claims about property ownership that, if true, could significantly impact our community. Frank Martinez, my elderly neighbor, raised his hand. Margaret, can you just tell us what the letter says? All this dancing around is making everyone nervous. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded. The letter claims that Mr. Carter owns the road infrastructure throughout Willowbrook Estates, including all streets, drainage systems, and utility access points. It alleges that we have been using his property without permission and demands payment for retroactive usage fees. End quote. The room erupted in concerned voices. Someone shouted, How is that possible? While another person demanded, Is this some kind of scam? Margaret held up her hand for silence. I want to assure everyone that the board is taking this matter very seriously. We've contacted our attorney and are investigating these claims thoroughly. I stood up, and the room gradually quieted. If I may, Margaret, I'd be happy to answer any questions folks might have. Her face flushed, but she couldn't very well refuse without looking petty. Mr. Carter, the floor is yours. I moved to the front of the room, feeling like I was about to give the most important presentation of my life. Thank you. I know this situation is confusing and probably a little scary for everyone. Nobody likes uncertainty, especially when it involves their home and property values. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many neighbors as I could. The facts are pretty straightforward, even if the legal situation is complicated. Back in 2008, my construction company built all the roads in this development. When the original developer went bankrupt, I ended up owning the roads through a mechanic's lien to recover unpaid construction costs. Mrs. Henderson, who lived on Maple Ridge Drive, raised her hand. Why didn't anyone know about this before now? Honestly, because it never mattered before. You folks have been maintaining the roads beautifully, everyone's been getting along fine, and I saw no reason to complicate things. I was content with the informal arrangement we had. So what changed? Asked Rick Coleman from his seat at the head table. I looked directly at Margaret. What changed was when someone decided to threaten to tow my tractor from my own driveway for violating community standards. That's when informal arrangements become formal property disputes. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Margaret's face was turning progressively redder, but she remained silent. Sandra Lou, the treasurer, looked up from a calculator where she'd apparently been running numbers. Mr. Carter, the letter mentions usage fees of over $400,000. Is that accurate? According to my attorney's research, that's the fair market rate for private road usage in this area, calculated over the 15 years since the HOA was established. I paused, letting that number sink in. But let me be clear about something. I didn't write that letter to bankrupt anyone or destroy this community. I wrote it because I was being harassed for parking my own equipment on my own property. And sometimes you have to speak in language that people understand. Frank Martinez spoke up again. Jesse, what is it you actually want here? Cut through all the legal talk and tell us what you're after. I appreciated Frank's directness. What I want is to be left alone to use my property as I see fit, within reasonable limits. I want to help my neighbors when they need it, like hauling storm debris, without someone threatening to tow my equipment. And I want mutual respect instead of harassment. And the usage fees? Sandra pressed. The usage fees are a legal reality based on property ownership. Whether and how we address them depends on how reasonable everyone wants to be going forward. End. I looked around the room again. I've been happy with our informal arrangement for 15 years. I'd be happy to continue it with some modifications. Margaret finally found her voice. What kind of modifications? An acknowledgement that I own the roads, for starters. A formal agreement that protects everyone's interests, establishes reasonable guidelines for road usage and maintenance, and prevents future harassment over RON. Property rights issues. And, in exchange? Margaret's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. In exchange, I'd be willing to waive the retroactive usage fees and continue allowing unrestricted access to all current residents. Think of it as a mutual easement agreement. You get guaranteed road access. I get recognition of my property rights. The room was quiet for a long moment as people processed this information. Finally, Sandra Lou spoke up. That sounds reasonable, Mr. Carter. What would prevent you from changing your mind later and demanding payment or restricting access? A formal legal agreement recorded with the county that binds me in NES. Future owners of the road property. Tom Brennan, my attorney, has already drafted a preliminary version that protects everyone's interests while clarifying the ownership situation. I pulled out a copy of Tom's proposed easement agreement and handed it to Sandra. The key points are guaranteed access for all current and future residents, shared maintenance responsibilities, and protection against arbitrary access restrictions. In exchange, the HOA acknowledges my ownership and agrees to respect my property rights. Margaret snatched the document from Sandra and scanned it quickly. This still leaves you in control of the roads. Because I own them, I said simply, but the agreement limits my control to reasonable restrictions. I can't arbitrarily block access or charge excessive fees. Think of it like any other easement agreement, except instead of running across someone's backyard, it involves roads. Rick Coleman leaned forward. What about maintenance costs? We've been paying to maintain these roads for years. The agreement addresses that too. Going forward, maintenance would be a shared responsibility based on usage. Since residents use the roads every day and I use them occasionally, the cost sharing reflects that reality. I'd contribute about 10%, the HOA would cover the rest, same as you've been doing. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand again. What happens if we don't agree to this? I'd been hoping someone would ask that question. Then we continue with the formal legal process. My attorney files a lawsuit for trespassing and unauthorized use of private property. The HOA hires lawyers to fight the claim. We spend months or years in court, running up legal fees that will probably cost more than the usage fees themselves. I let that sink in before continuing. Meanwhile, since there's no formal agreement allowing you to use the roads, I'd be within my rights to restrict access while the legal dispute is ongoing. Not saying I would, but legally, I could. The implications of that statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. Without road access, the houses would be effectively landlocked, property values would plummet, and residents might not even be able to get essential services like mail delivery or emergency response. Sandra was scribbling numbers on her calculator again. From the financial standpoint, Mr. Carter's proposal seems like the best option available. Fighting this in court could easily cost us $50,000 or more in legal fees, with no guarantee of a favorable outcome. Margaret was reading through the easement agreement, her expression growing more frustrated with each page. This gives you veto power over any major road improvements or modifications. Only unreasonable modifications, I corrected. The agreement defines reasonable improvements as anything necessary for safety, drainage, or normal maintenance. I can't veto pothole repairs or storm damage fixes. But if you want to install speed bumps or change the road layout, we'd need to discuss it first. That's still control, Margaret insisted. It's ownership, I replied. And it's a lot more control than you'd have if we end up in court. Frank Martinez stood up, his arthritis making the movements slow and careful. I've lived in this neighborhood longer than almost anyone here, and I've known Jesse since he moved in 6 years ago. He's a good neighbor who minds his own business and helps people when they need it. This whole mess started because someone decided to throw their weight around over a tractor that was helping clean up storm damage. He looked directly at Margaret. Jesse's been more than fair in his proposal. We acknowledge he owns the roads, we get guaranteed access and protection from future disputes, and we avoid a legal battle that could cost us a fortune. Seems like a no-brainer to me. Several other residents nodded in agreement. Margaret looked around the room, clearly realizing that public opinion was not on her side. I move that we accept Mr. Carter's easement proposal. Frank continued. All in favor? Wait. Margaret protested. This requires proper discussion and a formal vote by the board. Actually, Sandra Lou said, consulting a thick binder, according to our bylaws, any expenditure or legal commitment over $25,000 requires approval by a majority of all homeowners. Not just the board. Given the potential costs involved in fighting Mr. Carter's claim, this definitely qualifies. Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Fine. All those in favor of accepting Mr. Carter's easement proposal, raise your hands. Hands went up throughout the room. I counted at least 35 out of the 40-plus residents present. Even Rick Coleman raised his hand, though he looked uncomfortable about it. Those opposed? Those opposed? Margaret's hand shot up, along with 2 or 3 others near the front of the room. The motion passes, Sandra announced. Mr. Carter, when can we expect the formal agreement to be ready for signatures? My attorney can have the final version ready within a week, assuming everyone's comfortable with the terms we've discussed tonight. Margaret slammed her gavel down harder than necessary. Meeting adjourned. As people filed out of the clubhouse, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand or offer thanks for handling the situation reasonably. Mrs. Henderson apologized for Margaret's behavior, while Frank clapped me on the shoulder and invited me over for coffee to discuss his ongoing battle with the oak tree cleanup. Margaret was packing up her papers with sharp, angry movements. As I walked past her table, she looked up and fixed me with a cold stare. This isn't over, Carter. I think it is, Margaret. But if you want to keep fighting, that's your choice. Just remember that every day you delay costs the HOA more money in legal fees and potential liability. I left her there, surrounded by her charts and schedules and the wreckage of her authority, and walked home down the road I built with my own hands 15 years ago. Tom had the final easement agreement ready within 5 days, just as promised. The document was a thing of beauty. 23 pages of precisely crafted legal language that protected everyone's interests while establishing clear boundaries and responsibilities. It guaranteed perpetual road access for all current and future residents, established fair cost sharing for maintenance and improvements, and created a dispute resolution process for any future disagreements. Most importantly, it included a clause that prevented any party from unilaterally modifying the agreement without consent from both the property owner and a majority of the homeowners. Margaret couldn't single-handedly tear up the Depper agreement, and I couldn't arbitrarily change the terms or restrict access. The signing ceremony took place at Tom's office on a Thursday afternoon. Sandra Liu attended on behalf of the HOA, along with Rick Coleman and, somewhat surprisingly, Margaret herself. I'd expected her to boycott the proceedings, but apparently her sense of duty to the community outweighed her personal animosity. The actual signing took less than 10 minutes. But the handshakes and formal acknowledgments felt like closing a chapter on a strange period of neighborhood discord. Sandra seemed genuinely relieved to have the legal uncertainty resolved. While Rick was already talking about getting back to normal HOA business like planning the annual block party, Margaret signed her name with sharp, precise strokes and left without saying a word. That evening, I was back in my workshop, performing routine maintenance on my tractor when Frank Martinez knocked on the open door. "Got time for an old man to bend your ear?" he asked, holding up a six-pack of beer. "Always got time for you, Frank. How's the storm cleanup coming?" "Finished yesterday, thanks to you and that tractor." Still can't believe Margaret tried to have it towed. Frank settled into an old chair I kept in the corner for visitors. "You know, I've been thinking about this whole situation." "Oh? You could have really stuck it to all of us, Jesse. Could have demanded those usage fees, restricted access, made everyone's life miserable. But you didn't." I shrugged, focusing on the hydraulic fluid I was changing. Didn't seem right. Most folks in the neighborhood are good people just trying to get by. No point in making enemies over something that was working fine until Margaret decided to flex her muscles. Frank was quiet for a moment, sipping his beer and watching me work. "You know what the real lesson is here?" "What's that?" "What's that? Sometimes the person who looks like they have all the power is standing on ground that belongs to someone else." Frank chuckled. "Margaret spent 3 years acting like she owned this neighborhood, never realizing she was walking on your property every time she stepped out her front door." I laughed, picturing Margaret's face when she'd first realized the implications of my road ownership. "I never thought about it that way. But you're right. All that authority she thought she had was just borrowed, and she never knew it. Makes you wonder what other assumptions people make without checking the facts first." 2 weeks later, life in Willowbrook Estates had settled back into its normal rhythm. The signed easement agreement was recorded with the county clerk, eliminating any future questions about road ownership or access rights. The HOA had resumed its regular schedule of committee meetings and neighborhood improvement projects, though with noticeably less aggressive enforcement of minor violations. Margaret remained as HOA president, but her approach had changed significantly. The imperious demands and threatening notices had been replaced by polite requests and collaborative problem-solving. Whether this was due to a genuine change of heart or simply recognition that her authority had limits, I couldn't say. But the neighborhood was certainly more peaceful. I was out in my driveway, washing my tractor after another morning of helping neighbors with yard work, when a familiar figure approached from across the street. It was Margaret, but instead of her usual power-walking stride and clipboard, she was moving slowly, almost hesitantly. "Mr. Carter," she said, stopping at the edge of my driveway. "Do you have a moment?" I turned off the hose and faced her. "Sure, Margaret. What's on your mind?" She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her purse strap and avoiding direct eye contact. "I wanted to apologize for how I handled the situation with your tractor. I was out of line, and I let my position go to my head." The apology caught me off guard. In all our interactions, I'd never seen Margaret admit to being wrong about anything, let alone apologize for it. "I appreciate that, Margaret. Takes character to admit when you've made a mistake." "I've been thinking about what you said, about mutual respect and being reasonable neighbors. You had every right to make things difficult for all of us, but you chose not to. That says something about the kind of person you are." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for whatever came next. "I also wanted to ask you something. The HOA has been discussing some improvements to the community entrance. Maybe some decorative stonework and better landscaping? Since you built the original roads, I wondered if you might be interested in providing input on the design." Now that was unexpected. You want my opinion on community improvements? More than that, actually. If you're interested, we'd like to hire you to do the work. Your construction company. I mean, we've gotten quotes from other contractors, but Sandra pointed out that you already know the infrastructure better than anyone else. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. 3 weeks ago, Margaret had been threatening to tow my tractor as an eyesore, and now she was asking me to improve the neighborhood's appearance. I'd be happy to take a look at what you have in mind, I said. Though I should mention that I'm mostly retired these days. I only take on projects that interest me. Would this interest you? I thought about it for a moment. The community entrance was the first thing visitors saw when they entered Willowbrook Estates, and it had always been a bit plain. Some quality stonework and professional landscaping could really enhance the neighborhood's appeal. You know what, Margaret? I think it would. Email me the details, and I'll put together a proposal. Her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine relief. Thank you, Jessie. I really appreciate this. As she walked back toward her house, I reflected on how dramatically things had changed in just a few weeks. A property dispute that could have torn the neighborhood apart had instead become an opportunity for better communication and mutual respect. Margaret had learned that real authority comes from working with people, not trying to control them, while I discovered that sometimes you have to assert your rights to preserve the peace. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I was having coffee on my back porch when I heard the rumble of heavy machinery coming down Willowbrook Lane. Through the trees, I could see a large tow truck making its way toward my end of the street. For a moment, I wondered if Margaret had somehow arranged to have my tractor towed despite our recent reconciliation. But as the truck got closer, I realized it wasn't heading for my driveway at all. It was pulling up to the house 2 doors down, where the Johnsons lived. Mike Johnson was standing in his driveway next to a broken-down pickup truck that had been sitting there for weeks. I'd noticed him working on it occasionally, but apparently he'd given up on getting it running again. The tow truck driver was connecting chains to the pickup's frame, preparing to haul it away. I walked over to see if Mike needed any help. Getting rid of the old truck? Mike looked frustrated and a little embarrassed. Yeah, transmission finally gave up completely. Can't afford to fix it, and I can't afford to keep paying the tow truck to come back if it breaks down again. Where are you taking it? Salvage yard. Won't get much for it, but at least it'll be off my driveway before the HOA starts complaining about abandoned vehicles. The tow truck driver, a burly man in coveralls, looked up from his work. You're lucky I could fit you in today. Been swamped with calls ever since that story about the HOA road dispute hit the local news. That got my attention. What story? Oh, you haven't seen it? Some reporter got wind of what happened here in Willowbrook. Wrote a piece about homeowners associations overstepping their authority and property rights. Made quite a splash on social media. Mike pulled out his phone and showed me the article. The headline read, HOA President Learns Expensive Lesson About Property Rights. And the story was a fairly accurate account of the dispute over my tractor and the subsequent revelation about road ownership. The reporter had apparently interviewed several residents and gotten quotes from Tom Brennan about the legal implications. Says here that your case is being used as an example in property law classes at the State University, Mike said, scrolling through the article. You're famous, Jesse. I groaned. That's the last thing I wanted. This was supposed to be a private neighborhood matter. The tow truck driver chuckled as he finished securing the pickup. Private matters have a way of going public when they're interesting enough. Besides, sounds like you handled it right, standing up for your property rights while still being fair to your neighbors. As the truck drove away with Mike's old pickup, I thought about the unintended consequences of our little dispute. The story was apparently being shared as an example of how property rights issues could surprise even experienced homeowners and HOA officials. Tom Brennan was probably loving the publicity for his practice. But there was something else bothering me about the whole situation. The tow truck driver's comment about being swamped with calls suggested that our dispute had triggered similar conflicts in other neighborhoods. HOAs around the area were probably scrambling to verify their own property ownership and authority, while homeowners were questioning rules and restrictions they'd previously accepted without question. I spent the rest of the morning researching the news coverage online. The story had indeed gone viral, with hundreds of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories and property disputes. Some were praising me for standing up to an overzealous HOA, while others were criticizing me for creating unnecessary conflict over a simple tractor parking issue. The comments revealed a deep divide in how people viewed property rights and community standards. Some saw HOAs as necessary guardians of property values and neighborhood quality, while others viewed them as penny tyrants who violated individual freedoms. Our little dispute had somehow become a symbol of that larger cultural conflict. By afternoon, I was getting calls from reporters wanting to interview me about the case. I politely declined most of them, but eventually agreed to speak with a journalist from the local paper who seemed genuinely interested in the legal and community aspects rather than just the conflict drama. "The interesting thing about your situation," the reporter said during our phone interview, "is how it demonstrates the importance of understanding property rights and legal documentation. Most homeowners assume that HOAs have clear authority over common areas, but your case shows that assumptions can be dangerous." "That's probably the main lesson here," I agreed. "Don't assume you know who owns what without checking the actual deeds and legal documents. And don't let disputes escalate without trying to find reasonable solutions first." "Do you think this will change how HOAs operate in the future?" "I hope it encourages more communication and less confrontation. HOAs serve an important purpose in maintaining community standards and property values, but they need to work with homeowners, not against them." The interview was published the following week, along with a follow-up piece about how other local HOAs were reviewing their own property documentation and authority structures. Apparently, several had discovered similar ownership issues that had been overlooked for years. One HOA found that their community pool was built on land that still belonged to the original developer's family. Another discovered that a decorative fountain in their entrance was actually on city property, not HOA land. The ripple effects of our dispute were forcing communities throughout the region to clarify their legal foundations. Margaret, meanwhile, had thrown herself into the community entrance project with unexpected enthusiasm. She'd assembled a committee of residents to review design options and had even reached out to a landscape architect for professional input. The transformation from power-hungry micromanager to collaborative community leader was remarkable to watch. "I think I was trying to control things because I felt like everything was uncertain," she explained to me during one of our project meetings. "When you don't really understand your authority or your legal standing, you compensate by being overly aggressive about the things you think you can control. And now? Now I know exactly what the HOA can and can't do, what our responsibilities are, and how to work within the system instead of trying to dominate it. It's actually much less stressful." The entrance project became a model for how the new HOA approach worked. Instead of Margaret dictating what would be done, the committee solicited input from residents, researched options, and made decisions based on consensus and budget constraints. My role was to provide technical expertise and execute the work, but the community retained control over the design and priorities. The stonework we installed was beautiful, featuring locally quarried limestone arranged in welcoming columns flanking the entrance. The landscaping included native plants that would require minimal maintenance while providing year-round visual interest. The whole project came in under budget and ahead of schedule, largely because everyone was working toward the same goals instead of fighting over authority and control. 3 months after the original tractor incident, I was invited to speak at a property law seminar in the state capitol. The audience was primarily attorneys, real estate professionals, and municipal officials who dealt with property rights issues regularly. Tom Crade. Brennan had suggested I participate, arguing that my experience provided valuable insights for both legal professionals and property owners. "The key point," I told the audience, "is that legal rights and community harmony don't have to be mutually exclusive. In our case, asserting my property rights actually improved community relationships by clarifying everyone's roles and responsibilities." During the question and answer session, a municipal attorney asked about the broader implications of undocumented property ownership issues. "How common do you think these situations are, and what can communities do to prevent similar disputes?" "Based on what I've learned since our dispute, I'd say they're more common than most people realize. The solution is thorough documentation and regular review of property ownership records. Don't assume that just because something has been done a certain way for years, it's necessarily legal or properly documented. An HOA attorney from across the state raised her hand. What advice would you give to HOA boards who discover they've been operating outside their legal authority? Be proactive about fixing the problem before it becomes a crisis. Work with property owners to establish clear agreements that protect everyone's interests. And remember that your authority comes from legal documentation and community consent, not from your position or title. The seminar was well received, and I found myself becoming something of an accidental expert on property rights and community governance. Law schools were using our case as a teaching example, and I received invitations to speak at other conferences and seminars. But the real measure of success was what happened back in Willowbrook Estates. The neighborhood had become a genuinely collaborative community where residents worked together to solve problems instead of fighting over authority and control. Property values had actually increased, partly due to the improved community cohesion and partly because the legal certainty created by our easement agreement eliminated concerns about future access disputes. Margaret had evolved into an effective community leader who focused on facilitating collaboration rather than imposing control. The monthly HOA meetings had become productive working day sessions where residents planned community improvements and addressed shared concerns. Even my old tractor had found a new role in the community. Instead of being seen as an eyesore, it had become a neighborhood resource that residents could borrow for their own projects. Frank Martinez used it to clear fallen trees after storms, while the Hendersons borrowed it to haul materials for their backyard renovation. One evening, as I was performing routine maintenance on the tractor, Margaret stopped by to discuss the next phase of community improvements. We were planning to upgrade the storm drainage system, and she wanted my input on the bond engineering requirements. "You know," she said, watching me work, "I never thank you for handling our dispute the way you did. You could have made things much worse for all of us." "We all learned something from it," I replied. "I learned that sometimes you have to assert your rights to preserve the peace, and you learned that real authority comes from working with people, not trying to control them." "Do you think we would have found a reasonable solution if I hadn't been so confrontational about the tractor?" I considered that question carefully. Maybe, but probably not as quickly or as thoroughly. Sometimes conflict is necessary to clarify relationships and establish boundaries. The key is keeping the conflict focused on the issues, not making it personal. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about running for city council next year. Do you think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility? I think you've learned more about leadership and community service in the past 6 months than most politicians learn in their entire careers. You'd probably do a great job." As Margaret walked back to her house, I reflected on how dramatically our little corner of the world had changed. A simple dispute over tractor parking had revealed fundamental issues about property rights, community authority, and the importance of clear communication. The resolution had not only solved the immediate problem, but it created a framework for better community governance going forward. The real victory wasn't in asserting my ownership of the roads or in forcing the HOA to acknowledge my property rights. The real victory was in transforming a confrontational relationship into a collaborative one, turning a potential neighborhood feud into an opportunity for better understanding and cooperation. 6 months later, I received a call from a reporter working on a follow-up story about the long-term effects of our property dispute. She was interested in how the resolution had affected the community and whether the changes had been sustained over time. Property values in Willowbrook Estates have increased by about 8% over the past year, she reported during our interview. That's significantly higher than comparable neighborhoods in the area. Real estate agents are actually using your case as a selling point, emphasizing the legal certainty and community cooperation that resulted from the dispute resolution. "That's gratifying to hear," I said. "The goal was never to increase property values, but it makes sense that legal clarity and community harmony would have that effect." There's also been interest from other communities in replicating your easement agreement model. Several HOAs have contacted your attorney about creating similar arrangements for their own property issues. Tom Brennan had mentioned that he'd been getting calls from around the country about property rights disputes and community governance issues. Our case had apparently become a template for resolving similar conflicts in Other neighborhoods. The most interesting development, the reporter continued, is that several law schools are now teaching courses on community property law using your case as a primary example. You've become part of legal education. That was both amusing and slightly intimidating. The idea that law students were analyzing our neighborhood dispute as part of their routine. Education seemed surreal. But if it helped future attorneys better understand the intersection of property rights and community governance, then perhaps some good would come from all the attention. The reporter's final question was one I'd been asking myself. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the situation? I thought about it for a moment. I regret that it took a confrontation to resolve the underlying issues. I wish we could have had the conversations about property rights and community authority before anyone felt the need to threaten towing tractors. But given where we started, I'm happy with where we ended up. The story was published the following week, along with a sidebar about how other communities were learning from the Willowbrook Estates example. The article noted that property rights disputes were becoming more common as communities aged and original documentation was lost or forgotten, making our case increasingly relevant for homeowners and HOAs nationwide. As I read the article, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee and the morning sun filtering through the oak trees, I could hear the sounds of a healthy neighborhood. Children were playing in the street, neighbors were chatting over garden fences, and the distant sound of lawnmowers indicated that people were taking pride in their properties. The road that had caused so much conflict was now just a road again, serving its intended purpose of connecting homes to the wider world. The tractor that had sparked a dispute was parked in my driveway, ready for the next neighbor who needed help with a project too big for ordinary tools. But the real legacy of our dispute wasn't in the legal documents or the property rights. It was in the lesson that communities work best when people understand their roles and responsibilities, communicate openly about problems, and focus on finding solutions that benefit everyone rather than winning battles over authority and control. Sometimes the most important foundations aren't the ones made of concrete and asphalt, but the ones built from mutual respect, clear communication, and the willingness to work together toward common goals. Those are the foundations that last, that create communities worth living in and neighborhoods worth preserving. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes a dispute over a tractor to remind everyone what really matters in building a community that works for everyone.